Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with some more tips on critical listening. And today I would like to talk about dynamics, loud and soft. Now, you might think that this is like a simple issue, right? But it isn't. It isn't at all. It's actually a fascinating topic that could be a study, a major study in its own right, especially as it pertains to recorded music. What we need to understand, there are two things that I want to stress that I'd like to discuss that I think, happen to us regularly in our daily listening. And that if you sort of get a sense of, it will help you in listening to music of all kinds, not just classical music. The thing about classical music is that most of it is acoustic music. And because most of it is acoustic music, at least until quite recently, and not electronic, processed music, it has an enormously wide dynamic range. Now, that dynamic range can be expressed by composers in any number of ways. Back in the early days, often composers left out the dynamics completely. It was up to the performers to decide what should be loud and what should be soft. And if the music had a text, you could figure out what it should be. If it was slow, it could be quiet. If it was loud, if it was zippy and major key, it was fast and jolly and happy and loud. Things like that. You didn't have to do very much. And we hear a lot about, how in Baroque music, dynamics were terraced. That means they were either loud or soft. And the composers only used, loud and soft for the most part. There were plenty of composers in the Baroque period who notated crescendos, which, music history tells us were invented by the orchestra of Mannheim. The Mannheim crescendo is a big deal. Haydn's very first symphony begins with one. Begins with a crescendo, and they were fairly rare as notation. That doesn't mean that they were rare in terms of what people did. I mean, if you had a melodic line that was going from soft to loud, and it consisted of repetition of a simple motive, da da dum ba ba dum ba ba dum ba ba dum ba ba dum, and then all of a sudden ba ba dum. There is nothing to lead us to believe that a sensible performance would not naturally make a crescendo. They were not banned or outlawed. They were not discovered by digging around. I mean, dynamic nuance may not have been notated, but for heaven's sake, it was certainly expected. And whatever worked to make the piece more effective is what the players would do. It depended on, how well they got along as a corporate entity, and in the days before conductors, who was leading them and what they had discussed and how much time they had to work a piece up and, all that stuff. So, we can say that things may not have been notated all that much, but they also weren't ignored. Fortissimo and pianissimo, that is extremes of dynamic, started to be notated for the most part in the classical period. And, Haydn, for example, notated PP to FF. That was his basic range of dynamics. You went, PP is pianissimo. That's very soft. Then there's piano, that's soft. Then there's mezzo piano, which is half soft. Then there's mezzo forte, which is half loud. Then there's forte, which is loud or strong. Then there's fortissimo, which is very loud. And then Haydn, a good old Haydn, you gotta love him, invented the triple forte, fortissimo. It's at the end of the 7 last words, the earthquake. There's a triple forte for everybody, which is wonderful. However, the point I want to stress is that just because composers started to expand the notation of dynamics and to indicate dynamics with more precision, that does not mean, it really doesn't mean, that those dynamics were not present or that pieces that go from pianissimo to fortissimo were louder or softer than pieces that just went from piano to forte. It just meant that the work itself had to be interpreted by its performers to be as effective as possible. And if that meant playing really, really loud where it says loud, that's what you did. And if it meant playing really, really soft, that's what you did. And if you look at scores, like, I have for most of my life, you'll see that every composer has their own view of how they're going to scale the dynamics of a work or of their own music in general. For example, Martinu as a composer I love, and he's a sort of a neoclassicist. His dynamics are really rather restrained. He usually works within piano to forte, sometimes pianissimo to fortissimo, but mostly it's piano to forte, and he works within those parameters. So you'll find poco forte, a little loud, mezzo piano. He uses the qualifications, but he very seldom writes fortissimos and pianissimos, and never triple forte or quadruple piano or anything like that. Tchaikovsky famously writes like 5 or 6 pianos when he wants things really quiet, and 3 or 4 fortes when he wants things blastingly loud. Sibelius will write crescendo possibile, the biggest possible crescendo. And some composers do it that way too. They write piano possibile, or niente, as Vaughan Williams does, which means nothing. That fades out to nothing. You find that every composer has their own way, and so it's up to the performers to adjust their performance to capture the full dynamic range. You see, what is not ever in question is that unless a composer says the whole movement should be played pianissimo, for example, as in the finale of Vaughan Williams' Sixth Symphony, performance needs to be planned to take advantage of the full dynamic spectrum of whatever the ensemble can produce. I mean, that's critically important, and it's very important to remember that. The composer who actually had the widest dynamic range of any composer I've ever seen is Verdi. Believe it or not, it's Verdi. If you look at any of his scores, because with Verdi, the dynamics they're not just technical, they're not just technical instructions, they're emotional instructions. The famous aria, Il Ballen from Il Trovatore, from Act 2 of Trovatore, sung by the Conte di Luna, ends with, I think it's the most P's, pianissimos I've ever seen. I think there are 14 of them. It's marked P P P P P P P P P P P P P P P P P P P P P, however many. I mean, he'll use upwards of 10 of them. Pianissimos and forte to the other end, 4, 5, 6, who knows? I mean, you wouldn't think, right? Because Verdi's an Italian composer. They're always sneered at. Everyone thinks they're terribly primitive. His feeling for dynamics was insane compared to any of his contemporaries. But we didn't see it until the Verdi critical edition started to get issued, because his editors, of course, saw 14 Ps, and they just turned it into pianissimo. They ignored it. Of course they ignored it. But having all of those things there matters, because it gives a sense of what his thinking was and what he wanted the performers to try to do. So my first point about critical listening is that dynamics are special to every composer, but the performance has to learn how to take advantage of those, how to plan those, so that you get a satisfying dynamic range no matter what piece is being played and no matter how it's being played. It's got to sound like the ensemble is being exploited to its full expressive potential. It really does. And that's something that you will notice when you listen to these different composers. Honegger, I'll just give you one more example. Honegger used what's called general dynamics. General Dynamics is not just a technology company or a large electrical generating firm or something like that. No, he would just write General Dynamics piano, and it would apply to everybody. But that doesn't mean everybody could play it that way, because if you want to hear certain things, some people have to be louder than others. Mahler, on the other hand, is extraordinary in his dynamics, because he was the opposite of general dynamics. He gave every single part its own dynamics. And sometimes with Mahler, you've got some people playing loudly while other people are playing softly, because he wants to create that sense of blending of timbres, where he needed to have different instruments at different levels of strength. And that can be very, very difficult to get an orchestra to do. I remember doing Mahler's First Symphony, when we were doing the funeral march from the First Symphony, and he's got the strings, bowing with the backs of the bow and all kinds of weird stuff happening. And sometimes they're playing quietly while the woodwinds are playing fortissimo. And the tendency in an orchestra is for everybody to do what everyone else is doing. And so you have to say to them, no, Play your dynamics. Don't worry about if the guy next to you is playing fortissimo and you're marked piano. That's not a mistake. And I remember the conductor lecturing the orchestra about that because it was so unusual to break away from that concept of a general or instrumental or orchestral dynamic. And Haydn started doing that too. I talked about it in one of the Haydn Symphony Crusades, where he's got the horns playing loudly and the strings playing quietly. I mean, these are all things that people started to do. But when you're listening, as it applies to critical listening, the point I want to make is that you should always be conscious of the way that the instrumental ensemble, it doesn't matter whether it's a piano or a quartet or a violin sonata or a full orchestra, is being scaled so that the big passages are in fact the biggest passages, and the soft passages that are supposed to be, moments of hushed intensity really come across that way. And with that in mind, knowing that this is sort of how the world shakes out, I do want to talk about what happens on recordings and what conductors are doing, because this is a big, big issue. It's a big issue live, and it's a big issue on recordings. Recordings exacerbate problems that happen live. A lot of conductors, particularly today, make two errors, I think. One is the super duper excessive pianissimo, which is a terrible thing. And the great offender for that, and always has been, is Osmo Venska. There was always one moment in a performance where he would reduce the orchestra to such quietness that you couldn't hear it, either live or on a disc. It just went down to nothing. There was, one of the classic moments of that is at the end of in the finale of Sibelius' Fifth Symphony, right after the swan theme, when he recapitulates the opening of the movement very softly, and it's marked like triple piano. It's very quiet, but it's not marked to be inaudible. Kusevitsky, in a famous comment that he made to the BBC Symphony when he was conducting them, said, when he was talking about vibrato, actually, but, the fact that it's a vibrato issue isn't important in this context. He would say, always vibrato and pianissimo, the sound has to carry to the back of the hall. Some conductors conduct music as though there is no audience there. And they're not giving a live performance to real people with ears that need to receive sound waves. They just reduce everything to nothing. It's an abstraction. It's not a legitimate performance, option, in my view. It's not expressive. It's just this strange technical device done for its own sake. So I am always wary of performances that have too many of these super duper ultra pianissimo things. Then at the opposite end of the scale, there are so many conductors now who don't know how to play loud. They don't. And orchestras that have lost the ability to play loud. One of the classic examples was the Berlin Philharmonic under Claudio Abbado. They sounded terrible the louder they got. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that Abbado was a micromanager. He liked to fiddle constantly, and he wanted to be in control of what the orchestra was doing. And he was always correcting balances and telling people, what to do. And as a result, they got so nervous. When the music gets really loud in an ensemble, the orchestra is going to have a natural hierarchy of loudness, because not all instruments can play as loud. You're not going to hear the flutes. You're often not going to hear the violins or the brass and percussion go crazy, and you're not supposed to. You would notice if they were not there. They add to the fullness of sound coming at you, but you're not going to hear them as independent instrumental lines. And one of the real problems we have today with conductors is that they don't allow that to happen. They don't allow the orchestra's natural dynamic hierarchy to assert itself when the music turns really loud. I had a huge argument once with Günter Schuller about that, because he wrote a book called The Complete Conductor. And in this book, he argued that Tchaikovsky, for example, who wrote, 6 pianos and 4 fortes, actually expected you to have clear dynamic demarcation of each of those dynamic levels. And he was going to show how it was done. He also believed that you should not play louder than the loudest instrument of the orchestra could play, that the weakest instrument in the orchestra could play. So a fortissimo could never be louder than a fortissimo on a bassoon, even though a trumpet or a tam-tam or a timpani could be 20 times louder. That was just awful. And he recorded like a Brahms First Symphony and some other things to prove what he was saying. And they were the dullest performances you've ever heard in your life. And everything sounded inhibited and messed up. And they weren't any clearer. You didn't really hear that much inner voices or inner lines. I mean, there was nothing to be gained by doing that. And so today, playing loud has become a huge issue. And I've talked about it in these videos, and I've talked about it in my written reviews, that orchestras that have these micromanager conductors, they are so uptight and they're so controlled that the music, the vitality and the impact of the music is simply destroyed. I saw a recording of, a live performance of Michael Tilson Thomas doing Mahler First at Carnegie Hall with the San Francisco Symphony. Now, at the end of Mahler First, you know what's happening. The horns are standing up sometimes. They should. Conductors don't always make them do it. And they're going da, 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 da. The cymbals going da, 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 crash, da, 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 crash, like this. And Mahler is very careful with his markings. He marks the cymbals fortissimo sometimes and forte others. So one is supposed to be a little less loud than the other. But this is the climax of the whole symphony. It's the grand finale. You are not supposed to exaggerate this difference. I can understand. You want to go crash versus crash, but you don't want to go crash versus crash like that. And that's what Tilson Thomas was doing. He was drawing attention to the difference in the dynamic levels of the cymbal part for its own sake. And the result of that is that you were paying attention only to what the stupid cymbal player was doing instead of the melody and the horns and everything else that's going on. I mean, the cymbal part is essentially decoration, right? It's emphasis. And so, yeah, play it fortissimo, maybe make it a little less fortissimo, but not so much that you think something is going wrong, something is happening that shouldn't be. And that's what I mean by micromanaging conductors and orchestras who don't let them play loud. Most orchestras are very, very well trained. They're much better at what they do than the conductors are, quite frankly, because they played the same music over and over again under numerous conductors, and they know it. And they know what loud is, and they know what soft is. One of the great conductors when it comes to that sort of stuff is Nimi Yarvi, because he knows when to get out of the way and let the orchestra do what orchestras naturally do. And so that's what I mean when I talk about, orchestras that don't know how to play loud. And I know a lot of you have mentioned the same thing when we've had these discussions. It's a real issue today. It really is, because these conductors, they want to assert their own personalities and be different at all costs, and they're just getting in the way of the music. So these are two aspects of dynamics that I think you should pay attention to assist you in listening critically. The crazy piano that you can't hear, the inhibited fortissimo that never quite gets off the round, that never sounds as though the orchestra is just going crazy and the music is having its way with us. We want to be given a good shake. We don't want to always be focused on what the conductor's doing or always focused on that inner melodic line or something that otherwise would get buried. To hell with it. Let it get buried. Not everything is supposed to be heard all the time. One of the things that Tovey talked about was the fact that Greek sculptors, when many Greek sculptures were actually painted, but the paint's gone, so all we see is white marble. But they painted the backs of the sculptures as well as the front because the gods see everywhere, even though we don't. And we don't hear everywhere, and that's normal. It's absolutely normal. What's abnormal is the conductor who wants us to see the back of the statue. So keep that in mind when you're listening and think about how conductors plan the scheme of dynamics over the entire work, where the climaxes fall, where the moments of silence fall, and then whether they let the players play. I mean, boy, that's a big deal. And that's I think, just a critically important issue. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope this little tips for critical listening is useful when you're approaching your own listening sessions. Take care.